7 bullets, 7 rounds tore through his chest and legs. Any normal soldier would have been unconscious in seconds, but this Australian just lay there on the stretcher, calm as a man waiting for his morning coffee, and asked the American medics, "Are you going to patch me up or just stand there staring?" The medics froze. 3 of them actually stepped back in shock, not because of the wounds. They had seen terrible wounds before. No, what terrified them was something else entirely. Something in this man's eyes. Something in the way he talked about his injuries like they were happening to someone else. And here is the thing. This was not some freak incident. By 1968, American medical staff across Vietnam were whispering about the Australians, sharing stories that sounded impossible, stories about men who declined anesthesia during surgery, men who watched doctors stitch their own bodies with nothing but mild curiosity, men who lost enough blood to fill a bucket and kept giving tactical reports. The Pentagon wanted answers. They sent a team of psychiatrists and doctors to investigate. What they discovered was so disturbing that the reports were immediately classified, buried for decades. Because what the Americans found was not courage. It was not willpower. It was something far more unsettling. The Australians had found a way to break something inside themselves, to rewire the connection between body and mind, to turn ordinary men into something that American medics could only describe with one chilling phrase. They do not bleed like us. What exactly did the Australian SAS do to their soldiers? What ancient techniques did they borrow from Aboriginal hunters? And why did the Pentagon decide that America should never adopt these methods, no matter how effective they were? Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Vietnam War. You will hear what those classified reports actually contained. You will learn why American medics dreaded treating Australian casualties. And you will discover the terrible price these jungle ghosts paid for their superhuman abilities. Stay until the end, because what you are about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about the limits of the human body and the cost of pushing past them. The helicopter touched down at the field hospital in Long Bin, and what the American medics saw on the stretcher made 3 of them step back in visible shock. The man lying there had taken 7 rounds across his torso and thighs, wounds that would have rendered any normal soldier unconscious from blood loss within minutes. But this one was awake, not just awake. He was calm. His eyes tracked the medics with an unsettling clarity, and when they hesitated, he spoke in that distinctive Australian drawl that the medical staff had learned to dread. "Mate, you gonna stand there gawking, or are you gonna patch me up so I can get back to my boys?" The senior medic, a 23-year-old sergeant from Ohio who had already treated over 400 combat casualties in his 9 months at Long Bin, would later describe that moment in his private journal. He wrote that he had seen men survive terrible wounds before. He had watched soldiers cling to life through sheer determination. But the Australians were different. They did not cling. They did not bargain with fate. They simply refused to acknowledge that their bodies had any right to fail them. And that refusal, that absolute denial of biological reality, terrified him more than any wound he had ever treated. But this was only the beginning of what American medics would discover about the men from down under. This was not an isolated incident. By 1968, American medical personnel across Vietnam had begun sharing stories about the Australian SAS soldiers who passed through their facilities. These stories spread through whispered conversations in mess halls, through letters home that families found too disturbing to discuss, through official after-action medical reports that were quietly classified and filed away. The common thread running through every account was the same bone-deep unease. These men did not respond to trauma the way human beings were supposed to respond. Something had been done to them, or something had been awakened in them that placed them outside the normal boundaries of medical experience, and yet the most unsettling revelations were still ahead. To understand why Australian SAS soldiers bled differently, or more accurately, why they responded to bleeding differently, we must first understand where these men came from and what had been done to their minds before they ever set foot in the jungles of Vietnam. The selection process for the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in the 1960s was not merely rigorous. It was designed to fundamentally rewire the relationship between a man and his own body. The selection course took place in the brutal terrain of Western Australia, where temperatures could swing from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold within a single 24-hour period. Candidates were pushed beyond exhaustion, beyond hunger, beyond thirst. They were forced to march distances that military physiologists had calculated to be at the absolute edge of human endurance. And then they were pushed further. The attrition rate was staggering. Of every 100 men who began the selection process, fewer than 15 would complete it. Some dropped out voluntarily. Others were carried out on stretchers, their bodies having simply shut down in protest against the demands being placed upon them. But the physical hardship was merely the foundation for something far more radical. What made Australian SAS selection truly distinctive was its psychological architecture. The instructors were not merely testing endurance. They were searching for a specific type of mind, one that could disconnect the experience of suffering from the response to suffering. They wanted men who could observe their own pain as if it were happening to someone else. Men who could note the damage being done to their bodies with the same detached interest that a mechanic might show when examining a faulty engine. This was not coincidental. The Australian military had studied the experiences of British SAS soldiers in Malaya during the 1950s, and they had reached a disturbing conclusion. The most effective jungle operators were not the bravest men, or the strongest men, or even the most skilled men. They were the men who had somehow developed the ability to place their bodies in a separate category from themselves. These operators could sustain wounds that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers and continue fighting not because they were heroic, but because they had genuinely stopped processing pain as a signal to stop. However, nobody anticipated just how far the Australians would take this principle. The selection process was designed to identify candidates who already possessed this capacity and to develop it further in those who showed potential. Through sleep deprivation, through controlled starvation, through exposure to increasingly intense physical stress, the instructors broke down the normal psychological barriers that protect human beings from pushing themselves to destruction, and then they rebuilt those barriers in a different configuration, one that allowed the operator to keep functioning long after his body had every right to fail. When the first Australian SAS squadrons arrived in Vietnam in 1966, the American military establishment paid them little attention. Australia had committed only a small force to the conflict, and the SAS contingent was smaller still, never more than a few hundred men at any given time. The Americans had hundreds of thousands of troops in country, including their own elite special operations units. What could a handful of soldiers from a nation of sheep farmers possibly teach them about warfare? This dismissive attitude would not survive contact with reality. Within months of their deployment, Australian SAS patrols were achieving results that defied statistical probability. Their kill ratios were extraordinary, by some calculations more than 50 times higher than conventional American infantry units. Their casualty rates were remarkably low, and the intelligence they gathered during their long-range reconnaissance patrols was proving invaluable to Allied operations throughout the region. American commanders began to take notice, and with that notice came questions. How were the Australians achieving these results? What were they doing differently? The answers they received were unsatisfying. Australian officers spoke vaguely about bushcraft and patience, about small unit tactics and Aboriginal tracking techniques, but these explanations did not account for the enormous performance gap. There had to be something else, something the Australians were not talking about. The first clue came from an unexpected source, and it would shake the American medical establishment to its core. The first clue came not from tactical observations, but from medical reports. American medics who treated Australian SAS casualties began filing unusual observations with their commanding officers. These observations were initially dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding, but as more reports accumulated, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. The Australians were physiologically responding to combat trauma in ways that did not match established medical understanding. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan was a combat medic attached to the 3rd Field Hospital at Saigon. In his 18 months of service, he had treated soldiers from every Allied nation operating in Vietnam: Americans, South Vietnamese, South Koreans, Filipinos, Thais, and Australians. He kept meticulous personal notes on his cases, a practice that was technically against regulations but widely tolerated among medical personnel. These notes, discovered among his personal effects after his passing in 2014, provide one of the most detailed accounts of the medical anomalies observed in Australian SAS casualties. What Brennan documented would haunt him for the rest of his life. In an entry dated March 15, 1968, Brennan described treating an Australian sergeant who had been extracted from a patrol that had made contact with a North Vietnamese army company. The sergeant had sustained a through-and-through gunshot wound to the left shoulder, a shrapnel wound to the right thigh, and multiple lacerations from hand-to-hand combat. By any normal assessment, these wounds should have resulted in significant blood loss and shock. When the sergeant arrived at the hospital, his blood pressure was stable. His pulse was elevated, but not dangerously so. He was alert, oriented, and, Brennan noted with evident disbelief, attempting to give a detailed debrief of the contact to an intelligence officer who had arrived at his bedside. The sergeant had to be repeatedly ordered to lie still while the surgical team worked on him. At one point, he asked if someone could bring him a cup of tea, but it was the sergeant's response to a simple question that truly disturbed Brennan. Brennan's notes continue with an observation that would be echoed by dozens of other American medics. He wrote that the sergeant did not appear to be suppressing his pain through willpower or courage. He appeared to genuinely not be experiencing it. When Brennan asked him to rate his discomfort on a scale of 1 to 10, the sergeant seemed confused by the question. He looked at his wounds as if seeing them for the first time, and then offered an assessment that Brennan found deeply disturbing. He said it was not that bad, that he had felt worse during selection. The reference to selection would appear again and again in Australian SAS casualty reports. Whatever happened during that brutal screening process, it seemed to fundamentally alter the way these men processed physical trauma. They did not describe their wounds in terms of pain. They described them in terms of functionality, whether a limb still worked, whether they could still hold a weapon, whether they could still move. The subjective experience of suffering seemed to have been edited out of their psychological vocabulary, and this was only the first of many disturbing patterns the medics would identify. The medical anomalies extended beyond pain tolerance. American medics began noticing that Australian SAS soldiers displayed unusual physiological responses to blood loss. The human body has a standard cascade of reactions when it begins losing blood rapidly. Heart rate increases to maintain circulation. Blood vessels constrict to preserve flow to vital organs. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow. The skin turns pale and clammy. These responses are involuntary, controlled by the autonomic nervous system. They happen whether a person wants them to or not. But the Australians seem to exhibit these responses at different thresholds than other soldiers. They maintained stable vital signs longer into blood loss than medical training suggested was possible. Their bodies appeared to be more efficient at compensating for trauma, as if they had been physiologically adapted to continue operating despite damage that should have incapacitated them. One explanation that circulated among American medical officers was that the Australians were simply starting from a healthier baseline. Their selection process weeded out anyone who was not in peak physical condition, and their training maintained that conditioning. American soldiers, by contrast, were often drawn from a broader population that included men who had never been particularly athletic. It stood to reason that the Australian soldiers would have more physiological reserve to draw upon when wounded. But this explanation failed to account for what happened during Operation Dogarara. The medical implications of the Australian approach became tragically apparent during Operation Dogarara in November of 1968. An Australian SAS patrol was ambushed by a North Vietnamese army force estimated at platoon strength. In the resulting firefight, 3 of the 5 Australians were wounded, including the patrol commander, who sustained a gunshot wound that severed his femoral artery. A severed femoral artery is one of the most rapidly fatal injuries a human being can sustain. Without immediate intervention, a person can bleed out within minutes. The patrol was operating deep in enemy territory, more than 12 kilometers from the nearest extraction point. By all medical logic, the patrol commander should have been beyond saving. What happened next defied everything American medics thought they knew about human physiology. But the wounded commander did not panic. He did not go into shock. According to the after-action report compiled from survivor interviews, he calmly instructed his men to apply a tourniquet while he continued directing the patrol's defensive fire. When the tourniquet proved insufficient, he guided one of his soldiers through the process of clamping the artery with a hemostat from the patrol's medical kit. Throughout this procedure, which any civilian would have found agonizing, he maintained tactical command. The patrol evaded pursuit for more than 6 hours before reaching an extraction point. The commander was conscious and giving orders when the helicopter arrived. He remained conscious during the flight to the field hospital. And when American medics finally took over his care, they found themselves facing a man who had lost enough blood to render most humans unconscious, yet who was still attempting to provide a situation report. He survived. The surgeons at Long Bin would later describe his case as medically inexplicable. The amount of blood loss he had sustained should have been fatal several times over. Yet his body had somehow continued functioning. His mind had remained clear, and his ability to command had never faltered. When asked how this was possible, the Australian medical officer who accompanied the evacuation gave an answer that the American surgeons found unsatisfying. He said that the bloke just refused to let his body give up. But the Americans were determined to find a more scientific explanation. The phenomenon of Australian SAS soldiers appearing to control their physiological responses through sheer mental discipline became a subject of intense interest among American military researchers. If the Australians had developed techniques for overcoming the body's natural limitations, those techniques could potentially be taught to American soldiers. the tactical advantages would be enormous. The first official American inquiry into Australian SAS medical anomalies was launched in July of 1968. A team of military physicians and psychologists was quietly dispatched to observe Australian operations and to conduct voluntary interviews with SAS personnel. The team was led by Colonel Harold Westbrook, a psychiatrist who had previously studied stress responses in American Special Forces soldiers. What Westbrook discovered would lead to one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Vietnam War. Westbrook's initial report, portions of which were declassified in 2008, reveals the deep unease that the Australian approach created among American observers. He wrote that the Australian SAS had developed a training methodology that deliberately induced what he termed controlled dissociation, a psychological state in which the operator could separate his awareness of bodily sensations from his decision-making processes. This was not a technique that soldiers learned consciously. It was a conditioned response that was built into their nervous systems through repeated exposure to extreme stress. The implications of this finding troubled Westbrook deeply. Dissociation is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, but it is typically associated with trauma and mental illness. Victims of severe abuse often develop dissociative defenses as a way of coping with experiences that would otherwise be unbearable. The idea that a military organization had found a way to deliberately induce this state and to harness it as a tactical advantage raised profound ethical questions. But what Westbrook learned next made his ethical concerns seem almost trivial. Westbrook attempted to interview Australian SAS operators about their experiences during selection and training. He found them uniformly reluctant to discuss the details. Several men told him, in almost identical language, that what happened during selection stayed during selection. Others claimed that they simply did not remember the most intense portions of the training, a response that Westbrook recognized as consistent with dissociative amnesia. The few operators who did speak candidly provided accounts that Westbrook found disturbing. One sergeant described a training exercise in which candidates were subjected to simulated capture and interrogation. The stress techniques used during this exercise were designed to push men to the absolute limit of psychological endurance. Some candidates broke, others did not, and those who did not break emerged from the experience changed. The sergeant described it as learning to leave his body behind, to put his mind somewhere else where the pain could not reach it. This was no longer just about pain tolerance. The Australians had discovered something far more profound about the human mind. The psychological dimension of Australian SAS training had roots that extended far deeper than the selection course. The regiment had developed close relationships with Aboriginal trackers and survival experts, and these relationships had influenced not just their tactical methods, but their entire approach to the warrior mindset. Aboriginal Australian cultures had developed, over tens of thousands of years, sophisticated techniques for managing pain, fear, and the psychological stresses of hunting dangerous prey. These techniques were traditionally transmitted through initiation rituals that tested young men to the absolute limits of endurance. The rituals were designed to produce hunters who could track prey for days without rest, who could ignore pain and discomfort, who could enter states of heightened awareness that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. The Australian SAS did not formally adopt Aboriginal training methods, but the influence was unmistakable. Operators who trained with Aboriginal trackers often returned changed, speaking of experiences that they found difficult to put into words. They described learning to quiet the parts of their minds that complained about hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. They described discovering reservoirs of capability that they had not known existed. And they described developing a relationship with pain that was fundamentally different from the one they had known before. One operator's account of this transformation would become legendary among those who studied the Australian program. One operator, in an interview conducted decades after his service, described a tracking exercise in which he spent 4 days following an Aboriginal instructor through the Western Australian outback. During this exercise, he was given no food and minimal water. He marched through terrain that tore his feet and legs. He endured temperatures that left him shivering uncontrollably at night and baking in the sun during the day. And at no point did the instructor show any sympathy for his suffering. On the third day, something shifted. The operator described it as his body giving up and his mind taking over. The pain did not diminish, but it stopped mattering. His exhaustion did not lift, but it stopped being an obstacle. He entered a state where he could observe his own suffering without being controlled by it. When he emerged from this state at the end of the exercise, he was a different person. He had learned that the limits he had always assumed were real were actually negotiable. And he had learned that negotiating them was simply a matter of refusing to accept them. This transformation, the shift from normal human being to what American observers would come to call jungle ghosts, was what made Australian SAS operators so effective and so disturbing. They had not merely been trained to tolerate hardship. They had been fundamentally rewired to process hardship differently. The signals that would cause an ordinary soldier to slow down, to seek safety, to preserve himself, simply did not have the same effect on these men. American Special Forces soldiers were also tough. Navy SEALs and Green Berets underwent their own grueling selection processes, and they emerged as formidable warriors. But the American approach was fundamentally different. American training emphasized teamwork, technical proficiency, and tactical excellence. It pushed soldiers hard, but always within the context of developing specific military capabilities. The Australian approach seemed to go further, into territory that American military culture was reluctant to explore. The difference became painfully apparent whenever the two forces operated in the same area. A pattern emerged in after-action reports. When Australian and American units operated in the same area, the Australians consistently stayed out longer, covered more ground, and maintained effectiveness under conditions that would force American units to extract. They did this with less support, less firepower, and less technology. They did it through sheer human capability, pushed to extremes that American military doctrine did not contemplate. The most unsettling aspect of Australian SAS medical anomalies was the way they extended beyond the immediate context of combat. American medics treating wounded Australians noticed that their unusual pain tolerance persisted throughout the recovery process. Procedures that would require sedation for other patients, wound debridement, drain removal, physical therapy exercises, were often tolerated by Australians with minimal anesthesia. Some medics found this impressive. Others found it deeply unsettling. And one case in particular would become the subject of hushed conversations for years afterward. One American physician, writing in a professional journal years after his service, described treating an Australian SAS corporal who had sustained burns over 30% of his body. The burn treatment process is notoriously painful, often requiring heavy sedation and powerful analgesics. The Australian patient declined all pain medication. He explained that he wanted to remain alert so he could monitor his recovery and return to duty as quickly as possible. The physician initially assumed this was bravado that would quickly crumble under the reality of burn treatment. It did not. Throughout weeks of painful procedures, the Australian remained calm, cooperative, and apparently comfortable. He engaged the medical staff in friendly conversation during treatments that reduced other patients to screaming. He asked intelligent questions about his prognosis and worked diligently at his physical therapy, and at no point did he display any sign that he was suffering. When the physician asked how this was possible, the Australian gave an answer that would haunt him for years. He said that pain was just information and that he had learned not to let information control him. This single statement encapsulated everything that made the Australians both admirable and terrifying. The psychological evaluation reports that emerged from American observations of Australian SAS soldiers were classified at an unusually high level. The official explanation was that the reports contained operationally sensitive information about Allied forces. But those who have seen portions of the document suggest that the real reason for classification was more troubling. The reports concluded that Australian SAS training produced soldiers with psychological characteristics that fell outside normal parameters. The controlled dissociation that allowed these men to function under extreme stress also produced other effects that were more concerning. The operators displayed blunted emotional responses, difficulty relating to people outside their unit, and a persistent sense of detachment from normal human experience. In clinical terms, some of these characteristics resembled the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but they had emerged before combat exposure, as a direct result of the training process. The Australians were not being traumatized by war. They were being deliberately conditioned into a state that resembled trauma because that state conferred tactical advantages. This revelation forced American researchers to confront an uncomfortable question. The American researchers who compiled these reports were divided on their implications. Some argued that the Australian approach represented an unacceptable risk to soldier welfare. Others argued that war itself was an unacceptable environment, and that preparing soldiers to survive it required methods that might seem extreme in peacetime. The debate was never resolved. The reports were classified, and official American military doctrine continued to emphasize different approaches. But the Australian SAS soldiers who moved through American medical facilities left an indelible impression on everyone who encountered them. Decades later, veterans of the Vietnam-era Medical Corps would still speak of the Australians with a mixture of admiration and unease. They had seen courage in many forms. They had seen men endure terrible suffering with dignity and determination. But the Australians were something different. They had seemed to transcend the normal human relationship with pain and injury, to operate on a level that other soldiers could not reach. Some medics tried to learn from what they had observed. Others wanted nothing to do with it. They felt that whatever the Australians had done to themselves had cost them something essential, something that could not be measured in kill ratios or mission success rates. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either perspective allowed. The Australian SAS soldiers were neither superhumans nor damaged goods. They were men who had been shaped by a system designed to produce specific capabilities, and they bore both the advantages and the costs of that shaping. They could do things that other soldiers could not do, but they had given up things that other soldiers still possessed. The legacy of Australian SAS methods would extend far beyond Vietnam. In the decades following the war, special operations units around the world would study Australian techniques and attempt to incorporate elements of their approach. Some of these efforts were successful. Others produced results that convinced military leaders to step back from the Australian model. But the core insight remained, and it would change military training forever. The core insight that human beings possess far greater reserves of capability than they normally access, and that these reserves can be unlocked through specific training methods, remains valid. Modern special operations training incorporates many techniques that were pioneered or refined by the Australian SAS. But the more extreme aspects of the Australian approach, the deliberate induction of dissociative states and the systematic disconnection of pain from response remain controversial. American medics who treated Australian SAS casualties in Vietnam were witnessing something that most people never see: human beings who had been deliberately engineered to transcend normal limitations. Whether this engineering represented a triumph of human potential or a violation of human nature remains a matter of debate. What cannot be debated is the effect it had on everyone who witnessed it. They did not bleed like us. That phrase, repeated by medic after medic in interviews and memoirs, captured the essential truth of the experience. The Australians were Allied soldiers, fighting the same war for the same cause. But something about them was fundamentally different, and that difference, however it was achieved, left American medical personnel struggling to understand what they had seen. The specific techniques used in Australian SAS selection and training were closely guarded secrets during the Vietnam era. They remained secrets for decades afterward, protected by the culture of silence that characterized special operations communities worldwide. Only in recent years, as veterans have aged and the events have receded into history, have more detailed accounts begun to emerge. And those accounts have confirmed the medics' worst suspicions. These accounts confirm what American observers suspected but could not prove: that the Australian approach involved methods that would be considered extreme by any normal standard. Candidates were subjected to stress inoculation protocols that pushed them to the edge of physical and psychological collapse. They were taught to reframe pain as mere sensation, to observe their own distress without being controlled by it, to place their sense of self somewhere separate from their suffering bodies. The selection process was designed not just to identify tough men, but to identify men with a specific psychological capacity: the ability to dissociate under stress while maintaining functional effectiveness. Those who possessed this capacity in latent form were identified through a series of escalating challenges. Those who did not possess it were removed from the program, not because they were weak, but because they were normal. The men who completed selection emerged transformed. They had discovered capabilities they did not know they possessed, and they had learned to access those capabilities at will. But the process left marks that were not always visible. Many veterans would later describe a persistent sense of being different from other people, of having crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. And for many of them, the crossing came at a price that would only become clear decades later. The medical anomalies observed in Australian SAS casualties were, in this light, not anomalies at all. They were the predictable results of a training system designed to produce specific outcomes. The soldiers who displayed unusual pain tolerance, who maintained function under conditions that should have incapacitated them, who regarded their own wounds with clinical detachment, these men were performing exactly as they had been conditioned to perform. American medics were not witnessing superhuman abilities. They were witnessing the results of deliberate psychological engineering. The Australian military had identified a set of mental and physical capabilities that existed at the far edge of human potential, and they had developed methods for reliably producing those capabilities in selected individuals. The process was demanding, the attrition was high, and the long-term costs were not fully understood. But the immediate tactical results were undeniable. This realization, that the differences between soldiers could be manufactured rather than merely discovered, had profound implications for military training worldwide. If the Australians could produce jungle ghosts through systematic conditioning, then, theoretically, any military could do the same. The question was whether the costs were acceptable, and who would bear those costs. The veterans who passed through this system have carried its effects throughout their lives. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, describing both the advantages and the burdens of their conditioning. They are proud of what they accomplished and proud of their service, but they are also aware that something was done to them that cannot be fully explained or understood by those who did not experience it. Many have struggled with the transition back to civilian life. The dissociative capabilities that served them so well in combat proved more difficult to manage in peacetime. The ability to disconnect from pain and fear also meant difficulty connecting with ordinary emotions. Relationships suffered. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to manage experiences they could not process. Others found ways to adapt, to rebuild connections that their training had weakened. The Australian government has acknowledged in recent years that some veterans of special operations experienced lasting psychological effects from their training and service. Programs have been established to support these veterans and to help them process experiences that fall outside normal therapeutic frameworks. The recognition has been welcome, but incomplete. The full story of what was done to these men, and what it cost them, remains only partially told. But for the American medics who treated them in Vietnam, the story was written in blood and silence. American medics who treated Australian SAS casualties in Vietnam could not have known the full context of what they were witnessing. They saw the results without understanding the process. They encountered men who seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human response, and they struggled to make sense of what they observed. But their observations were accurate. The Australians were different. They had been made different through a process that was deliberate, systematic, and effective. And the difference showed in every aspect of their response to combat trauma. Their unusual pain tolerance, their physiological resilience, their psychological detachment, their refusal to accept that their bodies had any right to fail. They did not bleed like us. This was not metaphor. It was precise description of a phenomenon that American medical science could not fully explain. The Australians had been conditioned to respond to blood loss, to pain, to injury in ways that defied normal expectations. They had been engineered for a specific purpose, and they fulfilled that purpose with terrifying effectiveness. The stories that American medics brought back from Vietnam, stories of men who watched their own surgeries with interest, who declined pain medication despite horrific wounds, who assessed their injuries with the detachment of mechanics examining broken machinery. These stories were true. They described real encounters with real soldiers who had been shaped by a real system to produce real results. And those stories continue to raise questions that have never been fully answered. The cost of this shaping remains a matter of debate. Some argue that the Australian approach produced the most effective small unit operators in military history. Men who could accomplish missions that no other soldiers could accomplish. Others argue that the approach sacrificed something essential about the soldiers themselves, that it traded their humanity for tactical effectiveness. The truth lies somewhere between these positions. The Australian SAS soldiers of Vietnam were extraordinary men who accomplished extraordinary things. They were also men who bore costs that they did not fully understand and could not fully articulate. They gave their country capabilities that no money could buy, and they received in return wounds that no metal could acknowledge. The American medics who treated them caught a glimpse of something that most people never see: the far edge of human capability and the far edge of human cost. They treated men who did not bleed like other men, who did not hurt like other men, who did not fear like other men. And they emerged from those encounters changed, haunted by questions they could not answer. What does it cost to become a jungle ghost? What is lost when a man learns to leave his body behind? What happens to warriors who have been engineered to transcend normal human limits? These questions have no easy answers. They may have no answers at all, but they remain persistent and troubling for everyone who has encountered the men who did not bleed like us. The medical reports from Vietnam have been declassified in fragments over the decades. Each release has added detail to the picture without fundamentally changing it. The Australian SAS soldiers who passed through American medical facilities displayed characteristics that could not be explained by fitness, training, or courage alone. Something had been done to them that placed them outside normal medical expectations. And the more researchers have learned, the more disturbing the picture has become. Some researchers have attempted to explain these observations in purely physiological terms. They point to evidence that extreme training can produce lasting changes in stress response systems, pain processing pathways, and cardiovascular regulation. The body adapts to the demands placed upon it, and the Australian selection process placed demands that pushed adaptation to its limits. Other researchers emphasize the psychological dimension. They argue that the dissociative capabilities developed through Australian training allowed soldiers to modulate their physiological responses through mental processes. By separating their awareness from their bodily sensations, these soldiers could maintain function under conditions that would overwhelm men with normal psychological architecture. The most likely explanation incorporates both perspectives. The Australian SAS training produced both physiological and psychological changes, each reinforcing the other. The result was a soldier whose entire being, body and mind together, had been calibrated for sustained high-intensity operations in the most demanding environments on Earth. American military medicine learned from these observations, even if the lessons were never formally acknowledged. Subsequent special operations training programs incorporated elements designed to improve stress response and pain management. Research into the physiological and psychological effects of extreme training expanded significantly. The recognition that human limits are more flexible than previously assumed has informed military preparation ever since. But the full Australian approach was never adopted. The ethical concerns raised by American observers remained unresolved, and the long-term cost to soldiers became more apparent as Vietnam veterans aged. The capability gains were real, but so were the human costs. Military leaders had to weigh tactical effectiveness against responsibility to the soldiers themselves. The balance they struck varied by nation and by era. Some special operations programs moved closer to the Australian model, accepting higher costs for higher capability. Others pulled back, emphasizing methods that preserved more of the soldier's psychological baseline. The debate continues to this day, informed by decades of experience and research, but never definitively settled. The Australian SAS veterans of Vietnam are now elderly men, those who survive. They have lived with the effects of their conditioning for more than 50 years. Some have prospered, others have struggled. All have carried experiences that most people cannot imagine and would not want to. When they speak of their service, they rarely complain. They chose their path, and they accept its consequences. But they sometimes acknowledge, in quiet moments, that something was taken from them that they did not fully understand at the time. The ability to disconnect from pain was also an ability to disconnect from other things. From fear, but also from joy. From ordinary human connection, from the simple experience of being alive in a body that feels what it feels. They were made into weapons. Highly effective weapons. Weapons that served their country with distinction, but weapons nonetheless. And weapons, even human weapons, wear out in ways that are not always visible. The American medics who treated these men sensed something of this truth, even if they could not articulate it. Their unease was not merely about the unusual medical presentations they encountered. It was about the glimpse they received of what human beings could become when systematically pushed beyond normal limits. They saw men who had transcended ordinary human constraints, and they found the sight disturbing as well as impressive. They did not bleed like us. This observation contained more than medical surprise. It contained a recognition that the boundaries defining human experience are more malleable than most people realize, and that crossing those boundaries has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical context. The Australian SAS soldiers of Vietnam crossed boundaries that most soldiers never approach. They did so deliberately, knowingly, in service to their nation and their regiment. They paid prices that are still being calculated, and they left an impression on everyone who encountered them that time has not erased. The medics who treated them are mostly gone now, passed into history alongside the men they struggled to understand. But their observations remain, preserved in reports and memoirs and classified documents. And those observations continue to raise questions that military establishments around the world are still trying to answer. What does it mean to be human? Where are the limits of human capability? What is the cost of transcending those limits? And who has the right to make that decision for the soldiers who will bear the consequences? These questions echoed through the field hospitals of Vietnam every time an Australian SAS soldier arrived on a stretcher. Wounds that should have been fatal, somehow not quite fatal. Pain that should have been unbearable, somehow not quite felt. They echo still, across the decades, for everyone who has studied the remarkable and troubling phenomenon of the men who did not bleed like us.